Teresa. That was a really fine introduction. And this is thanks as well for inviting me out yet again. I was here as a participant at the conference at the conclusion of Teresa Oberman Center's last project in alliance with Grinnell College here. So it's good to be back and to see new faces and some old friends as well. So I'm here to talk to you about reframing the humanities as useful today. I'm going to choose as my epigraph something from Eliot's 1932 and 1933 lectures at Harvard University on the use of poetry and the use of criticism. Let me start, he says, with the supposition that we do not know what poetry is, or what it does or ought to do, or of what use it is, and try to find out in examining the relation of poetry and criticism what the use of both of them is. We may even discover that we have no very clear idea of what use is. At any rate, we had better not assume that we know. The application, of course, is mentally to substitute humanities for the word poetry in this epigraph. I'm going to start by communicating some lessons about the public perception of the humanities learned during a large Mellon-funded project that I led. I'm going to move on to my main topic of reframing the humanities as useful. Then I'll be talking about communicating the use of the humanities. That's the immediate anchor in the theme of this conference about graduate training and the public good. And if I have time, I'm going to tip the whole question around 180 degrees and talk a little bit, not about the use of the humanities, but about how the humanities might reframe the concept of use in society in general. This talk, Teresa actually heard in miniature one or two times, but it's since expanded a little bit, Teresa. So first of all, a project and the lessons we learned from it. This is something called What Everyone Says, WE1S, from 2017 to 2021, funded by the Mellon Foundation at 3 different institutions, my own at Santa Barbara, Cal State, Northridge, and also University of Miami. And I just want to flag for special attention the fact that there was a whole vertical stack of people involved, including a total of 98 participants, 72 of whom were graduate students functioning as RAs and as project managers. I'm especially proud to say that one of them is visiting campus today, is in the room in the back, Tyler Shoemaker, who is a member of the project in our summer research camps. I'm especially delighted to be able to say that this past week he learned that he has not only received a Newcomb Fellowship at Dartmouth College, but has also received an offer for a tenure-track job. So, congratulations. I'll come back to the fact that there are so many graduate students involved in this project later on. It's a project in which we collected over 1 million unique articles and other documents from journalistic media that mention the humanities. We analyzed them using computational means, primarily topic modeling, but also text classification, key phrase extraction, distinctive word analysis, guiding us toward close reading of selected materials. And then we reported out in a whole scale of activities ranging from one-page cards to full-scale scholarly articles. One of the real delights of that project, by the way, was the discovery of the one-page card format. Forcing humanists, including myself, to write in one page was actually an unexpected and unpredictable benefit of the project. This is what one of the cards looks like, are the 175 that we wrote. The humanities help us find the meaning of life. When you study newspapers around the nation's colleges, you learn that that's very much a discourse that is privileged and primarily concentrated in private and PhD level institutions, and not the public and other institutions. Other cards relevant to themes I'll come back to. The sciences stand out for the public in the media as distinct fields, unlike the humanities that all sort of blur together. And again, the public likes to take its science with objects, the bigger or stranger, the better. Our high-level conclusions we communicated in an article in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Datalist Journal in 2022 that I lead authored with the other leaders of our project. What Everyone Says, Public Perceptions of the Humanities in the Media. I'd like today to draw on some of those high-level lessons to inform my main topic, which is that of reframing the humanities as useful. Now, apologies first of all. Clearly, usefulness is not the only frame in which to talk about the humanities. However, it's an important one, and one of very long standing. I already cited the early 20th century debate and controversies about the usefulness of poetry and the humanities in general. But you could take that debate all the way back another century or more, for example, to P.B. Shelley's defense of poetry, goaded by Thomas Love Peacock, playing the role of a kind of an internet troll at that time, who questioned the usefulness of poetry. Shelley wrote, "But poets have been challenged to resign the civic crown to reasoners and mechanists. It is admitted that the exercise of the imagination is most delightful, but it's alleged that that of reason is more useful. Let us examine as the ground of this distinction what is here meant by utility." And if you read the defense of poetry, you'll know that 3 or 4 paragraphs along after this comes the great exordium on the poetry of life that remains my own as a humanist and former romanticist's most favorite passages in the humanities. We have more moral, political, and historical wisdom than we know how to reduce into practice. We have more scientific and economical knowledge than can be accommodated to the just distribution of the produce which it multiplies. The poetry in these systems of thought is concealed by the accumulation of facts and calculating processes. We want the creative faculty to imagine that which we know. We want the generous impulse to act that which we imagine. We want the poetry of life, which has really come home to me again recently because I've been studying the flourishing of data science in our universities and society. Today, I think this quotation has even more resonance now. Bringing it back to the beginning of the 19th century, to the time of the Enlightenment, I think it's especially useful because it gives us a good baseline to compare the divergence of the humanities and the sciences. Because at that time in the Enlightenment, in that period, you might recall that the sciences were not thought of as particularly useful. They were more or less a parlor trick, such as this literal parlor trick. This is Joseph Wright of Darby's painting of an experiment of a bird in an air pump. As you may know, one of the great discoveries in science of the 18th century was the fact of vacuum, which so frightened Dr. Johnson. That fact was communicated in parlors in tricks like this. Will that bird survive the evacuation of air from that chamber or not? We shall find out, and I suppose half the times the birds did not actually survive. Science has gradually migrated into the sphere of the useful in public perception, leaving as a kind of a relic outside that sphere the so-called basic sciences, which our scientists today still fear for, especially those in the S and M part of the acronym STEM, where T and E are perceived of as most useful. One of the great discoveries that I made during the University of California's exercise during the Great Recession to reimagine how we could flourish in the future without any funding at all, it's called the UC Commission on the Future. I was part of a subgroup of the Research Strategies Working Group. One of the great delights was discovering, working with scientists in that group, that they feared as much for basic research in the sciences as I feared for the humanities, and for many of the same kinds of reasons. Because, for example, studying the sex life of cockroaches was not perceived of as useful by any of the politicians in Washington. Humanities have gradually moved partly into the sphere of the useful, but not so much. And in fact, most of the humanities is positioned where basic science is today for the sciences. And the part that has made it into the sphere of the useful leaves a kind of a truncated version of the humanities behind. We speak of the critical skills, and really when you perceive the phrase critical skills in the media, the only meaningful part of that is skills. Critical means absolutely nothing in public discourse in this context. How to reframe the humanities as useful. My vocabulary here, you may recognize, borrows from the social sciences and from cognitive linguistics. Frame analysis, introduced in 1974 in Irving Goffman's work, and a little bit later in the work of George Lakoff and other a cognitive linguist. The Frameworks Institute, a nonprofit and think tank in Washington, is my most rich mentor in frame analysis. If you don't know frame analysis, essentially what it means is it's an analysis of the way people's perceptions about reality are shaped by little mental models, and I emphasize little, that is miniature simplified models of complex social and other situations which people carry around them in their heads and fit the world into, because it is most economical for thought and also most pleasurable to confirm one's own biases. This is from the Frameworks Institute. As an example, advocates say early childhood tooth decay is on the rise. The public thinks poor oral health in children is a symptom of bad parenting. So the frame is very much smaller, it's domestic, it's familial, it's my parent or my child. Advocates say, public or private, all kids need access to dental insurance coverage. Public thinks this can only be fixed through parent education. To prevent cavities, advocates say, kids need access to preventive treatments like dental sealants and fluoride protection. Public thinks kids need to be more responsible about brushing and flossing. Just try to penetrate that frame or to change it. In the analysis of Goffman and others, this is the problem of frame alignment or realignment, frame bridging, frame transformation. It's a very, very hard task. Now I pause here for just a moment to think about this with you from the perspective of the humanities. What the Framework Institute calls the difference between thematic frames oriented toward policy, toward the collective, etc., and episodic frames oriented toward individual, private life, social life, domestic life. That is very symptomatic of what we think the humanities actually are about. On the one hand, the humanities are about great civilizational contests and trends. So War and Peace, for example, in Tolstoy's novel. But on the other hand, the humanities are about private sensibility and intuition, about me and myself and my family. So Pierre in War and Peace and his thoughts. We span in the humanities both sides of the episodic and thematic. The question, I think, strategically for the humanities is how to operate in that spanning space in strategically useful kinds of ways. So reframing the humanities as useful. It's a very large problem. Just to simplify it for us today, I'm going to pick out three axes of it. If you were to draw a diagram of the multidimensional problem of the usefulness of humanities or of usefulness in general, you would have at least three axes to draw on X, Y, and Z. One of them is the axis between people and things. If you can give people things, they will think that you are useful. So I'm going to pull out from closest to my heart a thing which people ordinarily think is very useful. It's more than that, of course. It's elegant. In some ways, it's kind of a beautiful and a kind of a post-Bauhaus style, everything that Steve Jobs appreciated about the humanities, everything else. That's the x-axis. The y-axis, it's the relation between individuals and society. So actually, this is a very good icon of that as well. This is where I get my social media. This is where I text my daughter and so on. And the z-axis, out of many others that could be chosen, that which relates the ordinary, the novel, and innovative. So again, I think this makes a very good icon. When Apple introduced this, this is a very novel artifact and to be coveted partly for that reason. Just so happens, metonymically, that that's where the jobs are, and therefore that's what is perceived of as useful. If you can put people into relationship with things, individuals with society, and the ordinary with a novel, whether in the form of news or something else, you are perceived of as useful, and there are more rather than less jobs for you. So that's a very reductive diagram in three axes of usefulness. Let's put that on the shelf for a moment and look at the problem that the humanities have in fitting into that diagram of usefulness. This is one of the best statements advocating for the humanities that I know. 11 years ago, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences published under the leadership of Dick Broadhead then president of Duke, this document, The Heart of the Matter, the Humanities and Social Sciences. I've studied, as I said, 1 million documents like this, and this really is one of the best of them. It says things like this in advocating for the humanities, and I'm just going to pull out the 3 goals stated in its executive summary. 1, educate Americans in the knowledge, skills, and understanding they will need to thrive in a 21st century democracy. The humanities and social sciences provide an intellectual framework and context for understanding and thriving in a changing world. When we study these subjects, we learn not only what, but how and why. And then 2 and 3, I'm not going to read these in full. Foster a society that is innovative, competitive, and strong so that we can compete in the world. 3, equip the nation for leadership in an interconnected, that is global and international world. Now, if you do a discourse analysis of those 3 statements in the executive summary, and you can scale this up to the entire document and then up to the 1 million or so documents that I mentioned that we studied in the What Everyone Says project, you'll realize that there's a whole gang of words, a cohort like these: knowledge, understanding, ideas, intellectual, etc., that are associated with the humanities, versus another whole word set that the humanities are thought to need to bridge toward: world, society, economy. Or again, there are word sets like this: why and how associated with the humanities, set against another set of words like what, about the objective world. Or again, one of the most meaningful such schisms in discourse, words like we and ourselves, set against they and others. You realize from this miniature analysis of text that the framing problem of the humanities is that the humanities have been framed now, somehow in the modern era, as being all about the inner, the subjective, the individual in contact with the small organic community of the, family or the community around that individual. By contrast with a world which seems to be growing ever more outer, ever more objective, ever more not individual but mass social, and not communal but organizational. So that means political, national, international, and so on. How to close that schism, how to align the 2 frames is the framing problem that is at the heart of my talk today. So let's come back to my little 3D diagram of usefulness, the axes of people and things, individuals and society, the ordinary and the innovative, and take a look at them piece by piece individually from the perspective of the problem they pose for the humanities today. So people and things, first of all. This is one of the high-level lessons we learned from our W1 project, which we wrote about in our Daedalus article. The sciences discover things, according to the media, while the humanities just seem to give talks and discuss the one thing that the humanities seem to have, which are books. Put another way, the humanities are communicated at one remove from the people and the sites and the objects, the worlds that actually excite humanists. So as we say in the article, another significant absence in media representations of the humanities is what we might colloquially call the actual stuff of the humanities, the materials, contents, and outputs of humanistic endeavors. Straightforward reporting on the objects and outcomes of humanistic research, for example, seems notably missing in our corpus. By contrast, articles about scientific research often rivet the public's attention on actual things observed or discovered, like exoplanets, particle accelerators, genes, and so on. So, as I said earlier in that card, the public likes its science with objects. The bigger and stranger, the better. And if you can't actually show an object as a science communicator, you make it up, like this ray of radiation going across billions of years to reach us at Earth. If you think about it, the James Webb Telescope, this is its business today. It can't actually show us things that we see because of its spectrum, but in the newspapers, those invisible objects out there are shown to us as actual objects. Whereas scientific findings are thus announced in articles that start researchers find or studies show, humanities stuff in the newspapers tends to travel around in articles that are packaged in this way, professor to give talk on. So that's what I mean by being screened at one remove from the stuff that actually excites us as humanists. So the first reframing that I think needs to happen to make the humanities seem useful is to answer the question, where are the humanities objects? Now, on the one hand, the answer is obvious. They're in the museums and libraries. But the question that springs open like a trapdoor under that answer is, where are the living objects of the humanities, the ones that people can actually lay hands on and touch as part of their vital lives? Maybe Raiders of the Lost Ark is the wrong analogy here, so I'm going to substitute Bruno Latour. And the great exhibition that he co-curated in 2005, titled Making Things Public, in Germany. It wasn't about the humanities. It was instead about objectifying political science and political philosophy to make it vital in public life again. Ding politics is what Latour was after. He says, it's not unfair to say that political philosophy has often been the victim of a strong object avoidance. What would an object-oriented democracy look like? And the reason he's interested in centering objects in political science and philosophy is this. It's clear that each object, each issue generates a different pattern of emotions and disruptions of disagreements and agreements. There might be no continuity, no coherence in our opinions, but there's a hidden continuity and a hidden coherence in what we are attached to. In other words, objects, taken as so many issues, bind all of us in ways that map out a public space profoundly different from what is usually recognized under the label of the political. It's this space, this hidden geography that we wish to explore through this catalog and the must be like 100,000 objects that it featured and exhibited. So I pose a similar thought to you today about not the politics, but about humanities. And in fact, you could fit both topics in the same bracket of the need for objectification in rich and productive ways. It might be interesting to ask this question, for example, in today's blue versus red in our country, what do blue and red feel attached to as objects in common? Let's start with that. Let's put those in a room together and grow a community around that. That's both the political and the humanistic thought that I'm pursuing here by seeming to reductively objectify the humanities. So I challenge you to go home and with your students, think to yourself, what are the objects of the humanities that are living, vital, that could be brought forward to society? Could it be, for example, this hidden trove of Benjamin Franklin letters that was discovered by Dr. Houston, about 15 or so years ago? Could we restage that on television, sort of like MacArthur reconquering the Philippines on video? After all, if on the Discovery Channel they can make catching crabs exciting, surely they can make discovering a secret cache of Franklin letters exciting. Or so too, the Humanities Indicators Project of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, one of their great discoveries was just how many historic sites Americans want and like to visit. Those sites are among the objects that are living still in society. Or again, this is a research topic that I and my students have grown much interested in lately, infrastructure studies, or critical infrastructure studies as we call it. This is a photo I took in my visit to Christchurch in New Zealand after the earthquake. This is the Restart Mall there, which started with shipping containers. How do we think humanistically and in social ways about infrastructure, about the objects that society needs? My students have been producing what I call starter kits, little thinking kits that make interesting from a humanistic perspective the things around us in city and in country life. Rebecca Baker at the top example here, for example, has a whole starter kit that makes interesting benches in cities, especially those that are designed on purpose to make the unhoused people feel uncomfortable sleeping on them. So continue on to the y-axis of my diagram, individuals and their relation to society. One of our lessons as well from our W1S project is that the humanities do not scale well between me and the book that I love and larger social, national, and world issues. Media representation of the humanities diverge toward the extremes of the minutely specific, grounded in announcements of events and venues, and the unspecified, floating free from individuals and their communities into generalities. It suggests that the humanities struggle to be perceived as capable of bridging scales, of zooming into the individual human scale, while also zooming out to the societal scale. How the humanities help people move step by step from the minute experience of reading a book or attending a class, for example, to larger social and world action, and then back again in a round trip is not at all clear. So what I'm emphasizing here is not the fact that the humanities do not have interest in the local and the global at the same time. We certainly do. It's the lack of structured sequenced steps to move back and forth in between. So a second reframing surely will require answering the question, how can the humanities scale from me to the world? And I'm going to bring on stage here a very moving example from my own university. As you may know, about 10 years ago, we're coming up to the 10th year anniversary now, a very hurtful and damaged student killed 6 fellow students, injured another 14, by shooting, by stabbing, by ramming with car. And at the memorial occasion sometime afterwards, which I attended, in which the father of one of the English majors slain at the time, Richard Martinez, led the crowd in a chant, "Not one more." One of the most moving things I remember is the humanities on display there, the poems, the songs, the quotations from novelists and others. That certainly was the humanities in life and in death at the same time. How do we move from the local in this context where the humanities can have so much meaning to the national and the political on issues like gun violence? I'm inspired here by this grant opportunity that the NEH started a few years ago. It's called United We Stand. This is about the incident in Texas that is very similar. The NEH launched a new initiative called United We Stand, Connecting Through Culture, that leverages the arts and humanities to combat hate-motivated violence. The NEH has provided, in this instance, special funding to the agency's Texas affiliate, Humanities Texas, one of the 60 or so humanities councils in our nation, to partner with UDEL's El Progreso Memorial Library to establish an archive at the library preserving community and national responses to the tragic shooting that took place at Robb Elementary School in that year, 2022. So that's an example of creating a structure and a convention and a protocol for moving back and forth from the local scale to the national and policy scale, from the episodic to the thematic frames on issues such as gun violence. So the last axis in my little reduced diagram of the usefulness of humanities, the ordinary and the novel. Another great lesson we learned from our W1S project was that the humanities are indeed part of ordinary life. In fact, when you look at it, our corpus shows that the humanities are threaded throughout people's experience as part of the ordinary happenings of life, embedded in the everyday, event-oriented and local. The humanities participate in a constant stream of cultural activity and community gatherings and so on. Stuff that doesn't tend to make it into the headlines, but makes it into listings. I mean, just count up the number of humanities events, bookstore readings, poetry readings. It's like all the bacteria in the world, they weigh more than we do by far. And it's not just the quotidian and bacterial of the ordinary that is interesting. It's the fact that the ordinary is meaningful in a deeply and profoundly human way. One of the most interesting phenomena that we got interested in is the fact that in obituaries and wedding announcements in newspapers, the humanities are disproportionately present by contrast with, for example, the sciences and other fields. When it counts the most, when your loved one is passing or to be wed, people want to mention the humanities, whether in purely programmatic ways, he or she attended a humanities program, or more meaningful ways. They love this book, they love this song, they love this something else. That's what I mean about the ordinariness of the humanities. How do we connect that kind of ordinariness to the novel, the innovative, the new, as in the news? That's another reframing that needs to occur. How can the humanities link the ordinary to the novel, innovative, and extraordinary? Traditional journalism has a whole set of genres for dealing with that question. They're called backgrounders, sidebars, human interest stories, color stories, and the eventuated magazines in long-form journalism of one kind or another. Today, we are right now witnessing the reinvention of that in social media and other forms. After dinner last night, when Lauren was here, I want to mention podcasts here also. And I should also mention the genre of data stories. I've been teaching a course called Data Stories, Data-Driven Narratives in today's newspapers. Data, after all, is one of the ways in which novel phenomena like the COVID disease are introduced to the public and made meaningful in new kinds of ways. We need new genres, new ways of communicating the humanities so that its ordinariness, its objects, and everything else about it that we find valuable is made to appear useful. So with that, I'm going to segue to the part of my talk today that bears most directly on the theme of the Obermann Center's Mellon Project and the training of humanities graduate students for the public good. I've been talking in the last 5 minutes a lot about communicating the humanities, for example, those new genres of communication. So I think what I want to say to you toward the close of my talk is that when I say reframing the humanities as useful, what I'm really saying, translated, is communicating the use of the humanities. As an analogy, think of science communication. This is something I've been following for a while. This specific document from the Livermore Labs, now called the Berkeley Lab, they've been accumulating these examples for the last 20 or so years. Currently, there are 90 breakthroughs that they showcase that their lab is responsible for. So take a look at this. At the top of the list, resolve the solar neutrino puzzle. Completely useless. You have to score on the scorecard of use. This is toward the side of zero usefulness. But then look at the strategic thinking or tactical thinking behind what is number 2 on the list. Created a pocket-sized DNA sampler. So someone has thought long and hard about how to present and communicate science to the public so that basic science and TE, technology and engineering, are interleaved or interlaced with each other. Same pattern a little later on. Discovered the top quark, and then decoded thousands of plants and fungi, right? Katina, I think it's fungi. I mentioned Katina.
Lots of ways to pronounce it. All of them are fine.
I mentioned that because on the walk over here this morning, I discovered Katina's writing a book on mushrooms in the university. And then after that, decoded thousands of plants and mushrooms to advance sustainable bioproducts. Reframing the humanities as useful, I think, will require a communication act that is quite profound. I mean, communicating the world, the sites, objects, and people of humanities, both past and present, in ways that are living, will mean communicating the humanities to scale between me and the world. It will mean communicating the humanities to connect the ordinary to the novel, including but not limited to what makes the news. And so for that purpose, with my longtime partner in the forhumanities.org advocacy project, Kristy Hensler at Union College in New York, and some others around the nation, I've just started, or I'm trying to start, this may be my end of career tilting at windmills project, something called the Center for Humanities Communication, the CHC, for 3 purposes. One is to answer the question, what is humanities communication? Second is to answer the question, where are the humanities communicators? And the third, to answer the question, how can we support the professionalization and training of humanities communicators? And our explicit inspiration is science communication. So, by the way, I should mention that we've just achieved this landmark. We've secured the partnership of the American Association of Colleges and Universities, which has agreed to act as our fiscal sponsor and the receiver and administrator of our grants. So we've just actually begun in practical terms. We want to create shared open resources to help the humanities communicate. And even more important, we want to create a Humanities Communication Institute to help create structured training programs for humanities communicators. And as I just mentioned, our explicit inspiration is science communication. Science communication is now a rich and impactful field with resources. There are books about it. There are journals devoted to science communication. There are conferences each year. There are news outlets. This is where people in science communication place. There are social media avenues. And most relevant today, it's a field replete with training programs and courses at the graduate level and beyond. So, as a first step for this new Center for Humanities Communication that I'm trying to start, I'm happy to announce that as of this week, we've just received news that we got our first grant. Shelley Lowe with the NEH has given us and the AAC and U a small NEH Chairs grant to put in the same room. Will be hosted by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Cambridge, people who ordinarily do not sit around a table together. This will include leaders of major humanities, professional associations and organizations on the one hand, and science communicators, journalists, public relations people, designers on the other hand, to talk about what humanities communication might be. So check Center for Humanities Communication, or rather in progress. Part of whose goal, as I said, is to ask the question, what is humanities communication? So we're just starting to work on this. We know what humanities communication is not. It's not scholarship. So just to pick on some of my own scholarship here as an example, it's not that. It's not our programmatic literature and our websites and our department pages and our humanities division pages. It's not our course syllabi. It's not our lesson plans and PowerPoints. It's not, for example, this PowerPoint that I'm showing you today. A little bit closer is something like this cover page for the What Everyone Says project that I spent 3 months writing again and again the first 3 paragraphs in a voice that was pitched somewhere between the academy and the public. They say the humanities are in crisis, but they also say this. What else did they say? And who are they anyway? It took me months to find the right voice for that. Not unlike the time that I was asked to edit a book of children's poetry by Wordsworth. One of the most pleasurable activities as a scholar I've ever done. It took me months to discover what voice in which to write for the introduction to a child's book of poetry, and to write my first footnote. First footnote was to the Boy of Winander episode of the Prelude by Wordsworth. The boy is there calling to the owls. And my footnote begins, "Can you do this?" I think that's the best footnote I've ever If I had to grade my own effort, though, that would be a C+. And that's because as humanities scholars and researchers and teachers, we've hardly begun to think about what humanities communication might actually mean. It means all of these things in concert. Putting together a team of producers, authors, teachers, performers on a site with objects, creating kind of a scene or mise-en-scene of props and so on, with lighting to deliver a message, a narrative with the data and evidence behind it, in appropriate forms of media and technology today to reach not the audience in general, the public, but specific audiences in their rhetorical relations with each other. So hardly any of us think about the complexity of the audience as a rhetorical scene. That's not just like the students you're trying to reach. It's always a student in the ghostly presence of their parent or someone else. Or again, it's never the politician that one speaks to. It's the politician in the ghostly presence of the taxpayers to whom they are talking. Triangular and more rhetorical scenes of one kind or another. All those are interwoven back and forth with each other in the way that a movie company might need to storyboard out and script out in order to produce an act of communication. Hardly any of us think of what's involved in good humanities communication. We think that if we just take our lecture notes, move it to a public podium, and start like a talking head delivering that somehow reconstitutes that complexity. And this is not even to mention what is coming right around the corner. I predict an era not too far from now in which our daily written materials, our memos, our course syllabi, our lesson plans can be massaged by neural networks to produce at the end of the day materials that are closer to being output on social media, in blog forms, as podcasts, that is a little bit better prepared to be shown to the public. So what is humanities communication? A question in progress. Where are the humanities communicators? The Humanities Indicators Project has started on this in their workforce branch of their website. They show us where the jobs for humanities communication are today. They're in publishing, they're in research and teaching, they're in humanities institutions, they're in various other kinds of humanities occupations, in positions such as these, archivists, AV people, and so on. I actually got interested in this and have started counting myself. I looked at the sector for humanities organizations and associations, like the Mellon Foundation, like the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, like the MLA, and so on. And I started counting their job descriptions and how many people are listed on their websites in each such position. And obviously this will take many more people to do, to create a census like this, but these are the kinds of phenomena that I'm finding. These are the kinds of organizations that I'm looking at, and these are the positions they're listing that involve humanities communication. So up to the president and director, but all the way down to the designers, the web editors, the people who are in charge of various activities that keep the humanities organization going. I think a census like this that tells us where the communicators actually are will be quite useful in just filling in the rich and existing ecosystem of humanities communication and its potential as a professionalization track for our students, early career scholars, and others. I think the gem of a position that I found in that census was this one. This is the one I like best. Karen Price for the Humanities Council in Pennsylvania has the title of Storyteller and Program Coordinator. I think that is, in a nutshell, what a humanities communicator could be as a professional. So where are the humanities communicators? Question in progress. And finally, how can we support the professionalization and training of humanities communicators? SciComm training, again, is my analogy. And here is where I will bring my talk closest into contact with the theme of the Overman Center's Mellon Project on training graduate students for the public good. So in science communication, there is graduate training for science communication. So as a physicist in training, you are trained along the side to communicate to the media in case you want that to be your profession, and in case you want to integrate the two professions like Stephen Hawking did, writing books for the public as well as for other scientists. In SciComm, there's add-on training, credentials, MA programs, and others that you can add. And there is so-called embedded training that adds credentials onto jobs that you already have working for NGOs and nonprofits, etc., in the private or public sphere. What would be the equivalent in the humanities for providing structured training for professional humanities communicators where they live in situ within our humanities and university organizations and in other organizations in society? That's my question. So this is a picture from our summer research camps at the What Everyone Says project. We ran 3 of these. Tyler was involved in 2 or all 3 of these. In reality, 72 graduate students involved in 3 research camps over 3 summers amounts to a training institute in professional humanities work, including humanities communication. So the question I have is, how can we provide more structure, more formal credentials, more skill sets coming out of such training, which is currently happening organically, ad hoc, from the ground up. So just some preliminary kinds of approaches. I think first we need to recognize, structure, and support the professionalization of today's more extended and granular range of in-training, entry-level, and embedded positions for humanities communicators. So that's that entire vertical stack, from graduate students serving as GSEs and GSRs and RAs, to postdocs, fellows, and interns, to adjunct faculty, to scholar staff, out-acts, and what increasingly are called RSEs, research software engineers in the digital humanities sphere, and also a sphere of people that I'm especially interested in, let's call them administrative staff. People on our clerical staff, our office staff, who came out of our humanities programs and have a kind of a secret interest or attachment to them. One of the great examples in our nation is the Princeton Center for Digital Humanities under Meredith Martin. They were especially good, I think, in bringing to recognition, titling, and giving proper benefits and structured, privileges to people in all that vertical stack of different humanities positions and humanities communicator positions. How we communicate and structure our value for such people will be important in the future. I'm just now putting the finishing touch on this. This is a revision to the MLA guidelines for evaluating digital scholarship in promotion and tenure cases. It's gone from about 8 pages to 50 pages. And this is the section on enabling professional development and support for scholar staff who are humanities communicators. Giving them tuition credits to take further training in the universities, for example. Defining 20% of each work week to do their own research and other activities. There are so many more things that can be done to support that professionalization track. Secondly, include training and projects that involve humanities communication as part of graduate training and early career training. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move more rapidly just to show you the kinds of tools and skills you need to run collaborative teams today, much like the teams in startup companies and others. Can you work with your students in Slack and Figma and in the humanities equivalents of those as well? Can you work with your students to solve intellectual property and copyright problems for today's projects? Can you work with your students to learn how to produce at the end of a research project public-facing communication? Identifying and learning about audiences, writing and speaking in non-scholarly genres, writing one-page cards, and so on. If I had to do it over again, I would rerun my What Everyone Says project as a kind of professional training clinic in all these skill sets that need to be done in order to produce a communication that is ready for the public. That's ultimately what I would like the Center for Humanities Communication to do: to create general workshops in humanities communication, to create a scholars program, and to create social media internships for entry-level young people who might be interested in a career in humanities communication. So I'm at the end of my talk today, except for one concluding move. I won't take up too much more of your time, but I think it's useful to make this move. So far, I've been doing this. I've been reframing the humanities as useful. This is a kind of a fun cartoon use of ChatGPT to produce an image of the useful humanities. And it's a little bit ridiculous, right? Because it leaves unanswered the other part of the question. I don't think that the usefulness of the humanities makes any sense at all unless we accompany the question surrounding it with the question of what the idea of use in society in general should be. So I want to close by borrowing from an old piece of mine called Where is Cultural Criticism in the Digital Humanities, to make a few speculative thoughts about the need to rethink the idea of use in general, not just in the humanities, but in society, and how the humanities might contribute to that. I said way back then about the digital humanities, beyond acting in an instrumental role, DH can most profoundly advocate for the humanities by helping to broaden the very idea of instrumentalism, technological and otherwise. Because unless you broaden the notion of usefulness, we are caught in a vicious paradox or circle of conflicted usefulness. On the one hand, digital humanists worry that their field is too instrumental. Yet on the other hand, digital humanists also worry that their field is not instrumental enough by comparison, for example, with engineering. But then let's expand the frame a little bit. Now think about the humanities in general. Now I will widen the context. The insecurity of the digital humanities about instrumentalism, we should realize, simply shifts to a new register of worry experienced by the humanities at large. On the one hand, the humanities also struggle against the perception that they are primarily instrumental, because it seems that our job is to teach critical thinking skills and language skills and so on, and insidiously we are given more teaching as if our role were primarily service rather than something else. Yet on the other hand, clearly, the humanities suffer even more from seeming to be non-instrumental, to the point, and this is not a meme, this has happened to me as chair of the English department, that parents come up to you at commencement exercises and charge you with being a useless tutor of their daughter because she's only good for working at Starbucks. That actually happens to English chairs. And now let me widen the frame to its largest. Think about modern society. To be fair to the humanities, they are just a canary in the mine for the problem that modern society has with instrumentalism generally. It's hard to underestimate the problem that modernity has had with determination of all sorts after the age of God, that is, before the Enlightenment. Accusations of media determinism and technological determinism leveled at media theorists, for instance, are merely symptomatic of the uncertainty that modernity feels about secular determinism in total. That's just one of the levers of media or technological determinism, and it soon becomes clear that they connect to the total machine of historical, material, and social determination that determined us as moderns today. To put it mildly, in sum, contemporary society is existentially uncomfortable about determination and its instrumental agencies. It may well be that the concept of culture arose as an explanation in the 19th century and then all over again in the era of Raymond Williams and so on in the 1960s and 70s in order to deal with the determination problem. If not to solve it, then, as Claude Lévi-Strauss memorably said, to make it good to think. My thesis: humanities communicators trained in communication as an organic part of the humanities training can widen the public perception of the usefulness of the humanities, and in that very same act of communication, widen the public perception of what useful means, encompassing old and new senses of service, care, and repair. It's why in studying infrastructure studies, I'm so interested in that sector of that field called care and repair, as opposed to innovation studies. So I looked at the corpus of contemporary American English. Look at all these adjective collocates of the word useful. Here are some of them just waiting to be mined by the humanities and made more rich, more beautiful, more productive, more meaningful in society. Interesting. Meaningful. Courteous, that's a surprise. Insightful. Beneficial. Constructive, guiding, instructional, thoughtful, understandable. And then not the Racevskis at the end here, enjoyable, of all things. So I'll close by leaving you with this question. Can humanities communication help make usefulness today more human. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation. I think there are going to be a lot of questions and commentary that are inspired by this. I wanted to start off with a kind of institutional question. Here at the University of Iowa, we're fortunate to have a central administration that is very sympathetic to the humanities and to humanistic inquiry among our faculty, and that has said things like, as other institutions disinvest, University of Iowa wants to double down and invest in humanities and arts, writing and performing arts being among our main pillars of our branding. And so this is a major opportunity, of course, for precisely the type of communication that you're talking about that we're not doing enough of. And so my specific kind of question of institutional structure and functioning is, when we have, for example, strategic communications offices, the central one and strategic communications for our College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, who are willing to partner, how would you recommend partnering with them to reinsert some of these objects that seem to be missing, or to find some of these interstitial spaces of scaling that you're locating in the results of some of these projects that you presented? What would be some practices we might pursue that we haven't in the past in partnering with strategic communications?
It's a really good question, and I did not mean in my talk at all to discount the role that strategic communications on a campus has, along with offices devoted to development and to the securing of grants and so on. They're part of the same communication or puzzle or picture. I think the answer starts with the phrase that you use, which I think is very quite nice, the kind of interstitial spaces in between. Right now, at least in my own university, and I can't speak to University of Iowa here, in my dealings with the Office of Communication and with the Office of Research, which is in charge of development and so on as one of its sub-branches, I recognize that they have a definite and framed job to do in communicating our research, our teaching, not just to the public, but to those intermediaries in between the institutions, the grants, and the companies that help secure funding for us. There are very few, at least in my university, interstitial spaces where, for example, our students, our early career scholars might work organically together with those professional communicators in communicating our research. And this problem applies even to the level of the size of communications and the genre of them. I remember vividly one time for one of my early grant-driven projects being asked by Office Communication on campus, and then after that by the Office Development, to produce for some possible donors a précis of the project, which I did. The next day they came back and said, could you get that down to half the size, which I did. And then they came back and said, could you get that down to one sentence? Okay, now at the one sentence level, we're dealing with a different level of communication, a different kind of a gem-like bumper sticker kind of thing. I'm not trained to produce that, and I'm not trained to work with public relations people, designers, and others to produce that kind of communication. I think it's well worth thinking about how you produce communications that are in different genres and in different modes. And the best way to do so would be to create these kind of interstitial networks and structures that allow for people who are organically part of our research and teaching community, who see that as their mission-critical task, to work with people whose own mission-critical task is public relations and communications. We don't really have good structures for that today. Our College of Letters and Science at UC Santa Barbara about 3 years ago started a few intern positions for undergraduates to work with their office in producing communications for the website. I think we have much farther to go in that direction, so that working for the institution and for research projects in the way of public communication can be baked into our undergraduate education from the ground up. I have so many students who, because we do not have a journalism school at University of California, Santa Barbara, want to be involved in my projects from the communication angle. They want to be journalists in the future, or even more so, this is new, they want to be social media managers or campaigners. And I've actually had positions for my students in my projects as a social media manager who can produce those like 140 character bumper sticker like statements.
Alan, maybe is this on? Is that or not?
It's on.
Can you all hear me? Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's
I'll
on a
just
moment
put
ago.
this down.
Use your teaching voice.
Yeah. Alan, that was, thank you. That was really provocative. I took a lot of notes. I wanted to start with a comment, a sort of a contextual comment with the state that we're in, Iowa now, which is pretty deep red, much to many of our chagrin. And then with a question for you. So I'm in the process right now of working with one of the directors of our State Historical Society of Iowa. We're co-sponsoring a conference this summer, which we had imagined as Iowa History and the Humanities. It was flagged by our government relations office, and we were strongly advised to get rid of the word humanities because it was deemed triggering in the state that we're in. Apparently, humanities equals interpretation, whereas history equals facts. So now we're calling it Iowa History for Iowans. It's going to be a little more subversive when we're actually there. Cherry Nebby is going to be our keynote speaker, so more is rolling out from my Iowa peeps here, so we'll let you know more about that. I woke this morning to the article in the Daily Gazette, Des Moines Register, about new news about DEI, getting rid of DEI initiatives, requiring particular civics courses for history department to teach, and you have to teach certain things. So this is the state that we're in right now. So in the office that I'm in right now, the Office of Vice President of Research, we've been really fortunate to get an internal grant from the university, around a $300,000 grant for over 3 years, and we're calling it Writing for the Public Good. And the whole point of it, and we're working with strategic communicators across campus as well as in our office. So there's 4 main components to it. We're really trying to build capacity and to provide scaffolded training for our colleagues, not only in the humanities, but arts, social sciences, and sciences. So we have, an institutional membership to the conversation, where there are workshops, training faculty to write for the conversation, other outlets, op-ed workshops, Alan Alda, science communicating workshop, and also communicating ideas, summer workshops. So we're trying to build capacity. Right now we're focusing on faculty, tenure track, instructional track, clinical track, and we're hoping to broaden out to undergrads, and right now grad students can participate. So we're trying to build capacity and having this training. We've been talking with strategic communication, and they really want to help us continue this after the 3 years of funding. I'm really curious if you have any of that kind of scaffolded training at UCSB, and also for me, the next step would be, this is more in your wheelhouse, the promotion and tenure. Right now, the kind of public-facing scholarship, and also like being on History Channel, all these kinds of things, writing public-facing scholarship, writing books that come out through trade press, don't necessarily count for promotion and tenure. And that's something that I would personally like to see change. And I'm wondering, what is the tenor at UCSB and other institutions you're familiar with? Is this kind of communicating humanities work in different venues other than like the traditional book, which I adore, right? What do you see, not only at your own institution, but across institutions? Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. That was a lot, sorry.
There are a lot of pieces to that.
Yeah.
I already know that not only can I not connect all the dots here, but I won't remember some of them.
Sorry. You got me thinking.
I'll do my best. Let me begin this way by speaking to the first set of issues that you raised by mentioning what state you're in and the state of the state, as it were. California, you might think, is much more leftward of that, but of course we have our elements as well. We also have a state legislature, which ultimately controls the purse strings of things and see the world through those eyes. Here, we're on a very large issue related to the humanities, which has 2 fronts at the moment. One is that very few people in society actually know what the humanities are. And if you try to explain it to them, they could care less. Okay, so that's one branch of the problem. The other side of the problem is that the people who do know what the humanities are hate us for various political and other reasons, as you broached here. I think one of the smartest solutions to this is by the National Academy of Arts and Sciences in their Humanities Indicators project. I talked to Rob Townsend, who led that project, quite a bit about this. 2 or 3 years ago, they commissioned a national survey or poll just to see what Americans' engagement with the humanities is. And they made a very shrewd move at the start of this survey. They decided not to try to define the humanities in the way, for example, that the Act that established the NEH does, all these fields and so on. They simply asked what Americans did in their lives. And then they classified the activities that are humanities related. Did you go to a museum? Did you read a book? Did you see a film? And so on. So from the bottom up, empirically and socially, they put together the puzzle of what the humanities actually mean for the public. Or again, think of my own project, the What Everyone Says project. We decided to look for newspaper articles that contain the word humanities. And the reason we did that is simply having the one word there creates an interesting kind of a buffer or overlap zone between the academic understanding of humanities on the one side and a kind of a rough, unshaped, loose understanding of the humanities as reading books and seeing films and theater and enjoying, movies and so on, culture on the other. We wanted to see what that overlap zone is like. So in terms of the branding problem of the humanities in a society that is not necessarily on board with what the humanities stand for, I think a bottom-up and empirical approach of this sort is the right one. However, not one that avoids the ultimate issues. I don't think we want a humanities that ducks the hard problems of being identified with more or less left, liberal, and progressive causes, the kinds of causes that in a previous era, centuries ago, were identified not so much with politics as with civilizational issues, the progress of civilization in the 19th century, in German historicism, and so on. So we want to have our safe space, that part of the humanities which everyone will nod sagely with and say, yes, I want my daughter and my son to go to films and read books. And so we want that. But we also want to be able to identify with the more avant-garde, more edgy, more uncomfortable sides of the humanities. So for that reason, I've been leading a small project on a tiny grant, $10,000, with a team of 6 graduate students. We just put it online recently. It's called the Research Plus Activism Bibliography. It's a way of scoping and surveying the field for what used to be called scholar activism and community engagement. But since Black Lives Matter and social justice causes now has really become much more robust, much more multi-faceted, and much edgier as well. So we want to understand what we are doing in the university now that has both a kind of a safe cultural curatorial mission for like history, but on the other hand, a much edgier, dangerous, avant-garde, progressive side to it as well. Because otherwise, you're not true to the function of the university as an institution that is different from those of other dominant institutions in society today. So to segue to the other half of your question, and I can't touch all the parts of it, how do you reward a scholar or a student who's doing research for the goal of activism, for example, or for the public humanities? So as you may know, the MLA last year published a set of guidelines on evaluating and rewarding work in the public humanities. I mentioned the revision to the MLA guidelines on evaluating digital scholarship that has many more sections now on how to reward public-facing kinds of work. For my research in activism bibliography, one of the things I especially looked for and had the least success in finding are university policies for P&T, promotion and tenure, that deal head-on with the issue of work that engages, communicates with, and bidirectionally works with the community, and also deals with the dangerous sides of that. What kinds of actions are allowed on a campus in the interest of social justice-oriented research, and vice versa. So that's all apparatus and scaffolding that needs to happen. Whether our universities will have the courage to create that scaffolding, is another issue, because if you create the scaffolding, you make yourself visible in ways that can be targets.
Yeah.
I think that's everything I have to say about
Thank
that.
you. That was a lot. Thank you.
We want to open it up also to questions from the audience.